My name is Justine, and I am 33 years old. At 6 in the morning, my banking app flashed a single red line that said, "Access denied." My entire $680,000 trust fund was frozen overnight. When I called my mother in a panic, my father took the phone and softly said we had to step in because family comes first. I did not argue or scream. I just hung up the phone, drove straight to my bank in downtown Boston, and set my identification on the cold marble counter. David, my bank manager, clicked his mouse once, turned his monitor toward me, and asked who signed this power of attorney 3 days ago. Then he opened the digital metadata, and the room went completely silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you. Standing at that bank counter, the air conditioning chilled the sweat on my neck. David has been my bank manager for 5 years, and he looked at me with genuine terror in his eyes. On his high-resolution screen was a digital document claiming to grant total control of my assets to my parents. It looked absolutely flawless. It had my exact signature, a verified notary stamp, and all the official formatting required to bypass standard security checks. Anyone else would have panicked and assumed their identity had been stolen by some sophisticated overseas syndicate, but they picked the wrong victim. I am a senior forensic accountant for a global financial firm. My entire professional life is built on hunting down corporate fraud and finding the invisible digital threads that criminals carelessly leave behind. I did not let the panic consume me. Instead, my professional instincts took over completely. I stared at the forged signature and calmly asked David to pull the back-end audit log. I told him I did not care about the visual document because PDFs can be manipulated by anyone with basic software. I wanted the raw electronic signature metadata. I wanted the exact digital footprint of the device that executed this fraudulent contract. David typed quickly, his brow deeply furrowed, and brought up the raw data on his screen. There it was, plain as day. An IP address logged exactly at the moment the document was finalized. I read the string of numbers and felt a heavy, cold stone drop to the bottom of my stomach. I knew that specific IP address block. It belonged to a luxury high-rise residential building in Manhattan. Specifically, it belonged to the penthouse suite leased by my 29-year-old brother Cameron. Cameron is the undeniable golden child of our family. While I worked 60-hour weeks analyzing complex corporate spreadsheets and living quietly within my means, Cameron was celebrated as a visionary. He is a serial tech entrepreneur who constantly throws around meaningless buzzwords to sound important. In reality, he just burns through massive amounts of seed money and startup capital on failed ventures, lavish parties, and designer clothes. Our parents have always bailed him out, praising his entrepreneurial spirit, while completely ignoring my steady and quiet success. They always treated my accounting career as boring and insignificant compared to Cameron and his flashy lifestyle. That is exactly why my paternal grandfather left his entire $680,000 estate in a secure trust exclusively for me. Grandfather was a self-made man who recognized that I was the only person in our family who truly respected the value of a dollar and the meaning of hard work. Before he passed away, he specifically designed the trust so my parents could never touch it. He warned me that if they ever got their hands on that money, they would funnel every single cent to fund Cameron and his endless delusions of grandeur. Grandfather wanted to ensure I had a safety net that could never be compromised by family politics or my brother and his reckless spending habits. I looked back at the bank monitor, my mind racing as I pieced together the magnitude of their betrayal. Cameron was arrogant enough to forge a federal document from his own living room. He did not even bother to use a virtual private network to mask his location. He simply assumed I was too foolish to check the metadata, or perhaps he believed that family loyalty would force me to accept whatever they had done. The sheer audacity of his carelessness made my blood boil. I asked David to trace exactly what this forged power of attorney was being used for. His fingers trembled slightly on the mouse as he navigated deeper into the bank system. He pulled up the pending transactions and his face went completely pale. He swallowed hard before explaining that my trust fund was currently being listed as liquid collateral for a massive commercial loan. My heart pounded against my ribs as the reality of his words washed over me. Someone was trying to borrow millions of dollars from a major financial institution using my grandfather and his life savings as the absolute guarantee. David looked me directly in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. He told me that this process was already in motion. If this multi-million-dollar commercial loan defaulted, the lending bank would have the legal right to seize my entire trust to cover the losses. I would be completely wiped out. The financial security my grandfather had meticulously planned for my future would vanish overnight. I would be left with absolutely nothing, all because my parents decided to commit identity theft to fund my brother and his fraudulent fantasies. The silence in the bank felt suffocating. I realized this was not just a temporary freeze or a simple misunderstanding. This was a calculated and devastating attack on my livelihood. My father saying we had to step in echoed in my mind. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had conspired together to use my flawless financial record as a shield for Cameron. They assumed I would just roll over and take the loss to protect the family reputation. But as I stood there looking at the digital evidence of their crime, a cold and unshakable resolve settled over me. They forgot that I hunt financial predators for a living, and I was about to turn all my skills on them. I had just given my parents exactly 6 hours to reverse their federal crime. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the study doors to leave, but they swung inward before my fingers could make contact. There, standing in the threshold, was my brother. Cameron looked like a walking advertisement for unearned wealth and endless privilege. He wore crisp white linen pants and a cashmere sweater pushed casually up to his elbows, despite the late morning heat. In his right hand, he held a crystal flute filled with a perfectly chilled mimosa. He smelled of expensive citrus cologne and absolute arrogance. He leaned against the heavy wooden doorframe blocking my exit and took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. He had clearly been listening in the hallway. I could see the smug amusement dancing in his pale blue eyes. He did not look like a man who had just been caught committing a massive financial felony. He looked like a spoiled child who knew his parents would never let him face a single consequence for his actions. "Relax, Justine," he chuckled, stepping into the room and letting the doors click shut behind him. "You are making a massive scene over a minor logistical pivot." A logistical pivot. That is what he called identity theft. I stared at him, taking in the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He walked over to our father's mahogany desk and rested his hip against the polished wood, looking at me as if I were a confused employee who simply did not understand the corporate vision. "You need to look at the bigger picture here," he said, swirling the orange juice and champagne in his glass. Apex Solutions is about to disrupt the entire supply chain logistics market. We have institutional investors literally lining up to throw capital at us. But traditional banking is slow, and venture capital firms want to see guaranteed liquid reserves before they release the bridge funds. I did you a favor by using your trust fund. "A favor?" I repeated, my voice deadpan. "You forged my signature on a legal document to pledge my life savings as collateral for a commercial loan, and you call that a favor?" "I am bringing you in on the ground floor, Jussie," he said, using that childhood nickname I absolutely despised. "Do you have any idea what equity in a tech unicorn is worth right now? Once the Series A funding clears and we eventually go public, your little $680,000 trust fund is going to look like pocket change. I am going to make you a multi-millionaire. You should be thanking me instead of threatening to call the authorities over a temporary hold on your boring savings account." He smiled a bright camera-ready grin that had charmed countless naive investors and foolish romantic partners. But I am not a naive investor. I am a forensic accountant, and I know exactly how to read a balance sheet. "If your company was actually a unicorn," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "you would not need a bridge loan. If your proprietary software actually worked, the venture capital firms would have funded your operational costs up front. Real tech innovators do not need to steal their sister's inheritance to prove liquidity. You do not have institutional investors lining up Cameron. You are drowning in debt, and you are desperately trying to show fake capital to keep the lights on for one more month. The charming smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a vicious, ugly sneer. His fragile, narcissistic ego could not handle being spoken to with cold, hard facts instead of blind adoration. You have absolutely no vision, he spat, pushing himself off the desk. This is why you will always be a glorified bean counter. You make what, maybe 150 grand a year. You drive a sensible Japanese sedan. You wear off the rack suits to sit in a cubicle and look at spreadsheets all day. You have no idea how the real world works. You have no idea what it takes to build an empire. The people outside on that lawn are titans of industry and they believe in me. You are just bitter because grandfather gave you that money and you have done absolutely nothing with it. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I took a step closer to him, forcing him to look me directly in the eye. I know exactly how the real world works, Cameron. I know that Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1028 deals with aggravated identity theft. I know that bank fraud carries a penalty of up to 30 years in federal prison and a $1 million fine. I know that the Securities and Exchange Commission routinely destroys people who falsify liquidity to defraud investors. And I know that white-collar federal penitentiaries do not serve mimosas on Sunday mornings. My mother let out a sharp gasp from the corner of the room. My father stepped forward, his face purple with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You will not speak to your brother that way in my house," my father bellowed, his authoritative facade finally cracking. "He is trying to build a legacy for this family while you do nothing but tear him down. You are an ungrateful, vindictive child." I ignored my father entirely, keeping my eyes locked on Cameron. The bravado had faded from my brother's eyes, replaced by a sudden flickering realization that I was not bluffing. The legal terminology had finally pierced through his delusion. "You have until 5 o'clock," I said quietly. "Reverse the power of attorney. Withdraw the collateral. If you do not, I will hand the digital metadata directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I promise you, Cameron, I will build the forensic prosecution file for them myself." I turned and pushed past him. He tried to shift his weight to block my path, but I drove my shoulder forward, forcing him to stumble back against the desk. I grabbed the heavy brass handle, pulled the doors open, and walked out of the study without looking back. The contrast between the dark, tense atmosphere of the study and the bright, joyous celebration outside was jarring. I walked down the marble hallway and stepped out onto the front portico. The string quartet was playing a lively classical piece. Wealthy guests in pastel summer attire laughed and clinked crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne. Waiters circulated with silver trays of smoked salmon and caviar. My parents had spared no expense to maintain the illusion of absolute success and prosperity. They were burning money they did not have to impress people who did not truly care about them. I walked down the wide stone steps, ignoring the valet stand, and headed straight for the edge of the sprawling driveway where I had parked my car. The midday sun beat down on the asphalt, but I felt entirely cold inside. I had just drawn a permanent line in the sand with my family. There was no going back from this. I had threatened to send my own brother to federal prison, and I fully intended to follow through if they did not return my money. When I reached my car, I paused and looked back toward the house. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my father's study, I could see movement. My father was pacing back and forth furiously. He had a cell phone pressed tightly to his ear, and his free hand was gesturing wildly in the air. He was not calling the lending institution to reverse the fraudulent collateral hold. A man calling to admit a mistake and release a freeze does not look that angry. He looked commanding. He looked like a man declaring war. My fraud hunter intuition flared sharply. He was making a tactical move. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. The engine hummed to life, and the air conditioning kicked on, blasting cold air against my flushed face. I gripped the steering wheel, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I had given them a deadline. Now I just had to wait and prepare my documentation. Suddenly, my personal cell phone vibrated violently inside my leather purse resting on the passenger seat. Then it vibrated again, and again, It was a rapid-fire succession of harsh mechanical buzzes. I reached over and pulled the phone out. The screen was lit up with a cascade of urgent push notifications. They were not from the bank that held my grandfather's trust fund. They were from my primary retail bank. This was the institution that held my personal checking account, where my corporate paycheck was deposited every 2 weeks. It was where I kept my emergency savings and my daily operating funds. These accounts were completely separate from the trust and had absolutely nothing to do with my parents or my brother. I stared at the glowing screen, my breath catching in my throat. The notifications were identical and uniform, marching down the screen in alarming red text. Alert. Account frozen due to suspicious activity and legal hold. Please contact your branch administrator immediately. I opened the banking application with a trembling thumb. Face recognition logged me in. My checking account balance showed 0 available funds. My savings account balance showed 0 available funds. A red banner across the top of the application repeated the warning about a legal hold. I looked back up at the house, staring through the windshield at the distant figure of my father still pacing in the study window. He had not backed down. He had used his immense wealth, his high society connections, and his ruthless corporate lawyers to strike back instantly. He had filed some kind of emergency injunction or fraudulent legal claim to freeze my entire personal livelihood. He was trying to starve me out. He knew that if I had no access to my own money, I could not hire a lawyer. I could not pay my rent. I could not fight a protracted legal battle against his deep pockets. He wanted to break me so I would submit and let Cameron use my trust fund. He thought taking away my money would leave me powerless. He thought I was just a boring corporate employee who would crumble under pressure. But he forgot who he was dealing with. I do not just need money to fight back. I have specialized skills, and I was about to dismantle his entire life. I sat in the driver's seat of my modest sedan, staring at the bright red notifications cascading down my phone screen. My personal checking and savings accounts were completely frozen. My father had not just made an empty threat from his study window. He had executed a precise tactical strike. He knew exactly what he was doing. By placing a legal hold on my everyday funds on a Sunday afternoon, he effectively paralyzed my ability to hire private legal counsel. He knew a reputable litigator would require a massive upfront retainer to fight a commercial banking institution. I opened my wallet and counted exactly $42 in cash. I had half a tank of gas. I put the car in drive and left the sprawling Connecticut estate behind. I did not panic or cry. Panic is an emotional response, and forensic accounting requires the total elimination of emotion. I spent the entire drive back to Boston compartmentalizing the problem. I would survive the rest of the weekend. On Monday morning, I would walk into my corporate office. I worked for one of the most powerful financial firms in the country. I had access to elite tracing software, global banking directories, and a team of corporate lawyers who respected my expertise. I planned to use every single corporate resource at my disposal to absolutely dismantle my father and his fraudulent bridge loan. Monday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind blowing off the Boston harbor. I dressed in my sharpest charcoal suit, pulled my hair back into a severe knot, and walked toward the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed my firm. I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This building was my sanctuary. Inside these walls, I was not a disappointment or a stubborn daughter. I was a senior financial investigator with a flawless track record. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the grand lobby and approached the automated security turnstiles. I pulled my corporate identification badge from my lanyard and tapped it against the optical reader. The machine usually emitted a soft, pleasant chime, followed by the mechanical click of the gate unlocking. Instead, a harsh red light flashed across the scanner. A sharp computerized buzz signaled that my entry was rejected. I frowned and tapped the badge again. "Access denied" flashed on the small digital display. Before I could tap it a third time, a heavy hand rested on my shoulder. I turned to see the head of building security standing behind me with a grim expression on his face. He did not smile. He told me I needed to step out of the entry line and follow him immediately. He did not lead me to the bank of elevators that went to the forensic accounting floor. He escorted me to a private service elevator that only went to the human resources department. The human resources floor was uncomfortably silent. The security guard led me down a long carpeted hallway and opened the door to a sterile glass-walled conference room. Sitting at the long mahogany table was Richard Caldwell, the executive director of human resources. Seated next to him was a woman I recognized instantly as one of the senior partners from the firm Internal Legal Counsel. Neither of them offered me a seat. Neither of them offered a polite morning greeting. Caldwell pushed a thick manila folder across the polished wood of the table. He looked at me with a mixture of professional liability and deep personal discomfort. He told me that the firm had been served with an emergency legal notice at 6 in the morning. I reached out and opened the folder. The top document was stamped by a Superior Court judge in Connecticut. It was an emergency medical conservatorship petition. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon and my blood turned to ice. My father Thomas had filed a formal court petition to strip me of my legal autonomy. He was claiming that I had suffered a severe psychotic break and was no longer capable of managing my own financial or personal affairs. I flipped to the second page of the petition. Attached to my father and his absurd claims was a sworn medical affidavit. I read the signature at the bottom of the medical assessment. It was signed by Dr. Eris Thorne. I knew exactly who he was. Dr. Thorne was a prominent high society psychiatrist who played golf with my father every single weekend at their exclusive country club. He had not spoken to me or evaluated me in over a decade. Yet his sworn affidavit claimed that I was experiencing severe paranoid delusions and acute financial persecution mania. The affidavit specifically cited my behavior at the brunch yesterday. My father had twisted my threat to report his federal wire fraud into a psychotic episode. The document stated that I had stormed into a family gathering making wild, baseless accusations about imaginary federal crimes and threatening to destroy my brother and his legitimate technology business. Dr. Thorne wrote that my sudden obsession with white-collar crime and my aggressive demands for money indicated a dangerous detachment from reality. Because of my specialized knowledge in finance, the affidavit claimed I posed an immediate and catastrophic threat to my own financial well-being and the assets of my family. My father had legally weaponized my profession against me. I looked up from the documents and met Caldwell directly in the eye. I told him this was a fraudulent petition designed to silence me. I told him my father was attempting to cover up a massive instance of identity theft and wire fraud. Caldwell raised a hand to stop me. His face was completely devoid of sympathy. He explained that as a senior forensic accountant, I had unrestricted access to billions of dollars in client funds, sensitive corporate algorithms, and highly classified financial data. The firm had strict zero-tolerance liability policies. With an active medical conservatorship petition filed in a court of law claiming I was detached from reality, my security clearance was automatically and immediately revoked. The corporate attorney chimed in, stating that they could not risk a pending psychiatric case accessing their secure networks. It was a massive compliance violation. I demanded that the corporate attorney review the metadata of the power of attorney I had discovered at the bank. I told her that a simple digital trace would prove the conservatorship was entirely retaliatory. The attorney just shook her head. She coldly informed me that the firm does not involve itself in domestic legal disputes. Until a judge threw out the conservatorship petition, I was a walking liability. The legal department had already disabled my biometric access across all company platforms. I asked Caldwell how I was supposed to defend myself against a fraudulent court order when the firm had just cut off my salary. Caldwell offered a tight, unsympathetic smile and suggested I comply with my family and seek the medical help they were recommending. The sheer condescension in his voice made my jaw clench. He was looking at me exactly the way my father wanted the world to look at me, like a broken, hysterical woman who could not handle the pressure of her job. I was placed on mandatory, unpaid administrative leave effective immediately. I was not allowed to return to my desk. I was not allowed to speak to my team. I was permanently locked out of my corporate email, my financial tracing software, and the building itself. The security guard handed me a small cardboard box containing the personal items from my desk: my framed accounting degree, my favorite coffee mug, and a spare pair of shoes. That was it. 5 years of flawless dedication to this firm, erased in a 10-minute meeting because my father played golf with a corrupt psychiatrist. The security guard escorted me out through the back loading dock to avoid causing a scene in the main lobby. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind me, echoing through the cold morning air. I stood on the concrete loading dock holding my cardboard box, completely isolated. My father had executed a masterclass in financial and social warfare. In less than 24 hours, he had stolen my $680,000 trust fund, frozen my personal checking accounts, and stripped me of my career. He had successfully cut off every single resource I had. He wanted me to feel small, helpless, and totally dependent on his mercy. He wanted me to crawl back to his estate and beg for forgiveness. I walked away from the loading dock carrying my box down the busy streets of the financial district. Business professionals in expensive suits rushed past me, grabbing their morning coffees and discussing quarterly projections. Yesterday, I was one of them. Today, I was a ghost. I found a quiet bench in a small public park and sat down, resting the box on my lap. I needed to assess my actual inventory. I had my personal cell phone, but I knew my father paid the family plan bill, so he could likely track my location or shut off my service at any moment. I pulled the battery out of the phone and tossed the device into the nearest trash can. I could not afford to be tracked. I reached into my coat pocket. I had my car keys, my driver license, and the $42 in cash. My father thought he had cornered the market on ruthless strategy. He assumed that by stripping away my corporate identity and freezing my capital, I would panic. But forensic accounting is not just about having access to expensive software programs. It is a mindset. It is the ability to look at a chaotic system, identify the hidden variables, and exploit the vulnerabilities that arrogant people leave behind. My father and my brother were sloppy. They were accustomed to throwing money at their problems until they disappeared. They did not know how to operate in the shadows. I stood up from the park bench, leaving my corporate life behind. I did not need my firm to expose them. I needed to go completely off the grid, and I knew exactly who could help me build the perfect trap. I walked 3 blocks away from the financial district, keeping my head down and my face shielded from the security cameras mounted on the banking buildings. I found a busy subway station, paid cash for a ticket, and rode the red line all the way out to the quiet suburbs. I was heading to the home of my former colleague Mitchell. He was a legendary financial investigator who had retired 2 years ago after single-handedly dismantling a multinational embezzlement ring. He was brilliant, intensely paranoid, and completely immune to the kind of high society pressure my father wielded. More importantly, Mitchell despised arrogant, wealthy people who used the legal system to bully innocent victims. He was exactly the ally I needed. I walked the final mile to his modest ranch-style house. It was hidden behind a thick line of oak trees, offering complete privacy. I knocked on the heavy wooden door. Mitchell opened it a moment later, wearing a faded college sweater and holding a mug of black coffee. He took one look at my charcoal suit, my empty hands, and the fierce expression on my face. He did not ask any pointless questions. He simply opened the door wider and stepped aside to let me in. We bypassed the main floor and went straight down to his basement. Mitchell had transformed his entire lower level into a highly secure digital fortress. Server racks hummed quietly in the corner, pumping out a steady wave of heat. 4 massive high-resolution monitors were mounted to the wall above a heavy oak desk. He handed me a burner laptop that was completely wiped of any tracking software and routed through a military-grade encrypted network. I sat down and told him everything that had happened over the last 24 hours. I laid out the forged power of attorney, the frozen trust fund, the commercial bridge loan, and the retaliatory medical conservatorship. I explained how my father had weaponized a corrupt psychiatrist to lock me out of my corporate resources. Mitchell listened in absolute silence. When I finished, he set his coffee mug down and let out a low whistle. He told me that my father had executed a highly coordinated legal strike, but he had made one fatal miscalculation. My father assumed I would fight him in a courtroom where his expensive lawyers controlled the narrative. He forgot that I fight my battles in a server room where data never lies. Mitchell cracked his knuckles, sat down at the main terminal, and told me to start digging into the shell while he built a secure backdoor into the public tax registries. I told Mitchell that my parents were moving far too aggressively for this to be a standard startup loan. A legitimate technology venture does not require family members to commit identity theft and medical fraud over a single weekend. They were operating on a strict, desperate timeline, and I needed to find out why. I launched the encrypted financial tracking software on the burner laptop and started my hunt. I began with my brother and his heavily publicized company Apex Solutions. I bypassed his flashy corporate website and his glossy press releases. Those were just marketing illusions designed to distract naive investors. I went straight for the state business registry filings and cross-referenced them with federal corporate tax identifiers. Forensic accounting is like untangling a massive knot of invisible string. You pull one thread and you watch closely to see what moves. I pulled the thread on the Apex Solutions corporate headquarters address. It was not a high-tech laboratory. It was not a sleek corporate campus in Silicon Valley. It was a virtual mailbox registered at a strip mall in Delaware. I dug deeper, pulling up the state labor department filings to check his payroll records. Cameron claimed to have a team of elite software engineers building an unprecedented supply chain logistics platform. I ran the employee identification numbers through the database. There were no engineers. There was no product development team. There was no proprietary software. The only people receiving a paycheck from Apex Solutions were a public relations consultant, a personal driver, and a luxury event planner. The entire company was a ghost. Apex Solutions was not a tech unicorn preparing to disrupt the global market. It was a highly sophisticated shell company. It was a hollow digital facade designed to look like a booming enterprise to anyone who did not know how to look under the hood. I felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me as I stared at the screen. My brother was not a visionary. He was a con artist wearing cashmere. But I needed to know where the money was going. I asked Mitchell to run a trace on Cameron and his personal debt ratio using the backdoor he had just established. The results populated on my screen a few minutes later, and the numbers were absolutely staggering. Cameron had not just been losing money on bad business deals. He had been bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. He had luxury lines of credit maxed out across 5 different private lenders. But the most terrifying detail was the offshore routing numbers. Mitchell helped me trace a series of complex wire transfers that Cameron had executed over the past 12 months. He had been moving massive chunks of investor cash to anonymous accounts in the Cayman Islands. Simultaneously, he had been borrowing millions of dollars from unregulated underground creditors in New York to maintain the illusion of success. He was paying off old debt with new debt while skimming money off the top to throw lavish parties and lease his Manhattan penthouse. He was drowning in a highly toxic financial sinkhole. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. But how was he keeping the lights on? The underground creditors would have crushed him months ago if he was not showing them some kind of legitimate cash flow. I needed to trace the seed money that originally started Apex Solutions. I ran a reverse audit on the initial capital deposits from 3 years ago. The digital paper trail was intentionally convoluted. It twisted through 3 different limited liability companies, acting as financial buffers, before finally landing at the source. I stared at the screen as the names popped up on the final ledger. The initial funding did not come from venture capitalists or angel investors. The money came directly from my parents and their primary joint checking account. I sat in the glow of the monitors, processing the devastating reality of what I was looking at. For the past 3 years, my parents had been secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into Cameron and his empty shell company. They had been actively funding the illusion. They were not just innocent parents blinded by love for their golden child. They were active participants in a massive financial cover-up. They had poured their own wealth into his black hole of debt to protect the family reputation. And now the money was gone. The well had run dry. The underground creditors were closing in on Cameron, and my parents were completely out of options. That was why they needed my $680,000 trust fund. It was the only clean, untouched asset left in the entire family portfolio. They forged my signature and risked federal prison because they were totally desperate. Mitchell leaned over my shoulder, looking at the data trails crisscrossing the screen. He pointed to a secondary file he had just decrypted. He told me I needed to look at my parents and their current asset portfolio. I opened the file and felt the air leave my lungs. My parents, the aristocratic couple throwing a catered brunch on their manicured lawn, were completely broke. They had quietly taken out a third mortgage on their sprawling Connecticut estate. They had liquidated their retirement accounts. They had leveraged every single piece of property they owned to the absolute limit. They were teetering on the edge of complete financial ruin. The entire picture finally snapped into focus. This was never just about securing a simple bridge loan for a startup. My parents had forged my power of attorney to use my spotless trust fund as the ultimate bait. They needed my $680,000 to show guaranteed liquid capital to lure in a massive new round of legitimate, wealthy Wall Street investors. They were planning to use the new investors' money to pay off Cameron and his underground creditors and save their own estate from foreclosure. I looked at Mitchell, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It is a classic Ponzi scheme. They are using my name to legitimize a massive criminal fraud. Mitchell nodded grimly. He tapped his finger against the desk and said they were playing a highly dangerous game with federal regulators. If this new round of funding went through, the fraud would be cemented. And because my trust fund was the collateral tying it all together, I would go down with them as a co-conspirator when the federal authorities inevitably uncovered the shell company. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom and my future to save themselves. The realization eradicated any lingering trace of familial loyalty I had left. I turned back to the burner laptop and cracked my knuckles. I told Mitchell we needed to find out exactly when these new investors were scheduled to sign the final transfer authorizations. We needed to know the exact deadline. I was going to compile a bulletproof forensic dossier documenting every falsified record, every offshore wire transfer, and every forged signature. I started typing furiously, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I downloaded the damning financial records onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I was no longer just fighting to get my money back. I was fighting to dismantle a criminal enterprise operated by my own flesh and blood. They wanted to treat me like a liability. I was going to show them exactly how dangerous a forensic accountant with nothing left to lose could be. The clock was ticking, and I had a lot of work to do before I brought their entire empire crashing down around them. I asked Mitchell to isolate the communication servers for Apex Solutions. If my parents were pushing this hard to secure the liquidity guarantee, they had to be facing an imminent deadline. Cameron was arrogant, but he was not completely digitally illiterate. However, his executive assistant was overworked, underpaid, and careless with her network security protocols. It took Mitchell less than 20 minutes to bypass her basic firewall and mirror her entire email inbox directly onto my burner laptop. I began filtering the unread messages, scanning for keywords related to the new investment capital. I found the smoking gun buried in an encrypted thread marked highly confidential. It was a finalized itinerary for an upcoming charity gala. My stomach turned as I read the details. My parents and Cameron were hosting a massive philanthropic event at an ultra-exclusive Manhattan ballroom this coming Friday night. The charity aspect was just a beautiful, glittering distraction. The true purpose of the gala was hidden in the schedule for the VIP reception. At 9 in the evening, Cameron was scheduled to give a private presentation to a select group of billionaire hedge fund managers. According to the internal memos attached to the email, these investors were ready to sign the final authorization papers to wire $15 million directly into the Apex Solutions corporate accounts. I stared at the glowing screen, calculating the exact timeline. Today was Tuesday. I had less than 72 hours before that $15 million moved across the wire. If those funds officially cleared the banking system, the fraud would become an irreversible reality. Cameron would use the newly stolen money to pay off his violent underground creditors. My parents would quietly pay off the third mortgage on their Connecticut estate, saving themselves from the humiliation of a public foreclosure. And the federal government would eventually catch up to the Ponzi scheme. When the Securities and Exchange Commission inevitably raided Apex Solutions, they would trace the collateral back to the forged power of attorney. My grandfather and his $680,000 trust fund would be permanently seized by the government as the proceeds of a criminal enterprise. I would lose everything and likely face federal indictment as a co-conspirator simply because my name was on the frozen asset. I could not let that Friday night transfer happen. I needed to build a weapon capable of stopping a $15 million transaction in its tracks. I spent the next 14 hours locked in Mitchell and his basement, fueled by black coffee and pure adrenaline. I compiled a bulletproof forensic dossier. I did not just print out bank statements. I built a comprehensive, undeniable narrative of systemic financial abuse. I cross-referenced every single offshore wire transfer with my parents and their personal checking accounts. I documented the zero balance sheets of the shell company. I laid out the timeline of my father forging the medical conservatorship to silence me. By the time the sun came up on Wednesday morning, I held a 100-page physical binder in my hands. It was the complete autopsy of my family and their lies. But documentation alone was not enough to stop the digital flow of money. I needed an inside man at the institutional level. I used a secure encrypted application to send a single text message to David, my bank manager. I told him to meet me at a rundown diner on the edge of the city during his lunch break. I told him to come alone and leave his corporate phone in his car. David arrived at the diner looking completely terrified. He slid into the vinyl booth across from me, his eyes darting around nervously. He knew he had authorized a catastrophic transaction by accepting that forged document without verifying it with me directly. Before he could speak, I pushed a small manila folder across the sticky table. It contained a fraction of the dossier I had built. I watched his eyes widen in horror as he read the proof of the Manhattan Internet Protocol address, the shell company records, and the active federal fraud. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead. David was a career banker who valued his pension and his quiet life in the suburbs. He realized he was standing on the edge of a massive criminal conspiracy, and his digital fingerprint was on the approval. I kept my voice low and completely steady. I told him he had two choices. He could go back to the bank, say nothing, and go down as an accomplice when the federal authorities raided the branch. He would lose his pension, his reputation, and likely his freedom. Or he could help me set a trap and become the whistleblower who stopped a $15 million financial crime. David swallowed hard, his hands shaking so badly he spilled a few drops of his black coffee onto the table. He asked me what I needed him to do. I handed him a piece of paper with the specific offshore routing numbers Cameron intended to use for the Friday night transfer. I instructed David to quietly implement a hard stop protocol on those exact digital pathways within the bank mainframe. I did not want him to freeze the accounts yet, because that would alert my father. I wanted the accounts to remain active, but mechanically incapable of accepting incoming wire transfers. If the billionaires at the gala tried to send the money, the system would trap the funds in a permanent pending status. David wiped the sweat from his forehead and nodded. He took the paper and promised the trap would be set by the end of the day. With the banking system secured, I had one final and crucial stop to make. I borrowed Mitchell and his inconspicuous sedan and drove to a nondescript government building downtown. I did not go through the main reception. I used my specialized clearance to access a private side entrance used by financial contractors. I was there to see Agent Reynolds, a seasoned veteran in the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Reynolds and I had worked together on several complex corporate embezzlement cases in the past. He respected my meticulous attention to detail and my absolute refusal to cut corners. He let me into his cramped office, and I dropped the heavy 100-page forensic dossier directly onto his metal desk. I did not waste time with small talk. I told him I was handing him a $15 million active wire fraud and a multi-tiered Ponzi scheme on a silver platter. Reynolds opened the binder and started reading. The seasoned agent maintained a poker face, but I could see the slight shift in his posture as he realized the targets of the investigation were my own parents and my brother. He flipped through the pages of offshore routing numbers and the fake psychiatric holds. He looked up at me, searching my face for any sign of hesitation or emotional fragility. He had seen families tear each other apart before, but this level of premeditated destruction was rare. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to pull the trigger on my own bloodline. I looked him dead in the eye and told him they stopped being my family the moment they used my grandfather and his legacy to fund a criminal enterprise. I told him they had tried to strip away my sanity and my freedom to cover their tracks. I told him the exact location of the Manhattan Ballroom and the precise timeline of the VIP presentation. I instructed him to have a tactical team waiting in the service corridors of the hotel by 8:30 on Friday night. I warned him that if his team moved 1 minute too early, my father would use his high society lawyers to stall the arrests. The trap had to snap shut perfectly. Reynolds closed the binder, gave me a sharp nod, and told me the bureau would be ready. I drove back to the suburban house feeling a strange sense of absolute calm. The pieces were all in place. The digital pathways were blocked. The federal authorities were mobilized. The only thing left to do was ensure that my family could not spin their way out of the consequences. They had spent my entire life controlling the narrative. They had convinced their wealthy friends that I was a bitter, ungrateful daughter who sat at a boring desk all day. They had convinced a corrupt psychiatrist that I was suffering from a paranoid delusion. They relied on their polished public image to hide their rot. The only way to truly defeat them was to shatter that image in front of the very people they were trying to impress. I needed to infiltrate the charity gala and rip the mask off my brother in the middle of his big moment. I walked down into the basement war room where Mitchell was monitoring the digital tripwires. I told him the plan was set, but I had a logistical problem. I was currently locked out of my apartment, my bank accounts, and my corporate resources. I had exactly $42 in my pocket. I could not walk into an ultra-exclusive Manhattan billionaire charity gala wearing a wrinkled charcoal business suit. Security would spot me and throw me out before I even reached the ballroom doors. Mitchell smiled a rare, genuine smile and picked up his secure phone. He made a brief call to his wife Rebecca, who ran a high-end vintage boutique in the city. 2 hours later, Rebecca walked down the basement stairs carrying a heavy garment bag. She unzipped it to reveal a stunning floor-length emerald green designer gown. It was elegant, understated, and radiated exactly the kind of quiet old money wealth that my mother spent her entire life trying to emulate. Rebecca also brought a pair of flawless designer heels and a simple, delicate necklace. I held the emerald fabric in my hands, feeling the weight of the transformation. My father had tried to strip away my power by taking my corporate badge and my checking account. He thought my worth was tied to the digital numbers on a screen. But as I looked at the dress, I realized my true power was my mind. I was about to walk into the most exclusive room in Manhattan as a ghost. I had less than 48 hours to prepare my final strike. I spent every remaining minute memorizing the financial ledgers, anticipating every possible excuse my father might throw at the crowd, and perfecting my delivery. I was not going to yell. I was not going to act like the hysterical woman they claimed I was. I was going to be a cold, calculating force of absolute truth. Friday night was coming, and I was ready to bring the hammer down. I sat in the cold, damp basement surrounded by the low mechanical hum of server racks. The burner laptop Mitchell provided glowed with a harsh blue light that reflected off the concrete walls. Mitchell placed a fresh mug of black coffee on the desk beside my right hand. He did not say a single word. He knew better than to interrupt a forensic accountant when they were entering the zone. I cracked my knuckles, flexed my fingers, and stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. It was time to perform a complete digital autopsy on Apex Solutions. My brother Cameron had built his entire public identity around this company. He was the golden child, the visionary, the tech genius who was going to change the world. I was going to tear that illusion apart line by line, code by code, ledger by ledger. Forensic accounting is not about looking at the numbers people want you to see. It is about finding the spaces between the numbers. It is about locating the shadows where the real money hides. I started by bypassing the standard public portals. I ignored the glossy corporate website with its high-resolution photos of modern office spaces and smiling, diverse teams. Those images were purchased from stock photography databases. I knew this because I ran a reverse image search and found the exact same photos being used by a dental clinic in Ohio. It was a lazy, sloppy mistake, but Cameron had always been lazy. He relied on charm and expensive suits to blind people to his incompetence. I needed the hard legal architecture of the company. I accessed the state business registry databases, routing my connection through Mitchell and his encrypted proxies, so my digital footprint would remain completely invisible. I pulled the initial incorporation documents for Apex Solutions. The company was registered as a limited liability corporation in Delaware, which is standard practice for many legitimate businesses seeking favorable tax laws. But as I dug into the physical address listed on the incorporation paperwork, the first red flag appeared. The address did not belong to a sprawling technology campus or even a modest office building. I cross-referenced the coordinates with municipal zoning records and commercial real estate databases. The corporate headquarters of Apex Solutions was a tiny virtual mailbox located inside a failing strip mall next to a dry cleaner. There was no physical footprint. There were no desks, no conference rooms, no servers. It was just a post office box receiving mail that was likely forwarded directly to his luxury apartment in Manhattan. I pushed deeper, bypassing the basic firewalls of their internal corporate network. Cameron had hired a cheap third-party security firm to handle their digital infrastructure, and their protocols were painfully outdated. It took me less than 40 minutes to gain read-only access to their internal filing system. I started pulling the public tax filings and quarterly reports that they had submitted to their early angel investors. On paper, the company looked like it was spending a massive amount of capital on research and development. They claimed to be building an unprecedented artificial intelligence-driven supply chain logistics platform. If you are building a revolutionary software platform, you need software engineers. You need developers, coders, project managers, and quality assurance testers. I accessed their payroll processing accounts to see who was actually receiving a salary from Apex Solutions. I downloaded the entire employee roster and ran the names through professional networking sites and technical databases. The results were absolutely devastating. There was not a single engineer on the payroll. There was no chief technology officer. There were no developers. There was no repository holding thousands of lines of proprietary code. There were no patent filings pending with the federal government. The people receiving massive salaries from Apex Solutions were all image managers. There was a high-priced public relations consultant. There was an exclusive event planner who specialized in throwing luxury parties for Wall Street elites. There was a personal driver, a stylist, and a social media management team. That was the entire company. Apex Solutions had no product. They had no software. They had absolutely nothing to sell. It was a highly sophisticated shell company, built entirely on meaningless corporate buzzwords and aggressive marketing. Cameron was not building a technology empire. He was building a mirage, and he was charging investors millions of dollars for the privilege of looking at it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My brother was a complete fraud. He had constructed a massive financial house of cards, and he was standing at the very top of it holding a glass of champagne. But a mirage that expensive requires constant funding to maintain. If he had no actual product generating revenue, how was he keeping the lights on? Where was the money going? I needed to follow the cash flow. I opened a new window on the laptop and initiated a deep trace on the company banking records. I tracked the incoming funds from the early venture capital rounds. Millions of dollars had been wired into the primary Apex Solutions account over the past 2 years, but the money did not stay there. The second a large deposit hit the main ledger, it was immediately fractured into dozens of smaller microtransactions. This is a classic money laundering technique known as layering. The goal is to make the money move so fast and in so many different directions that standard auditors simply give up trying to follow it. But I am not a standard auditor. I am a predator, and I had caught the scent of blood. I tracked the microtransactions as they flowed out of the domestic accounts. They moved through a series of nested limited liability companies, each one acting as a brief holding pen before pushing the money further away. I followed the digital trail across international borders. The routing numbers pointed to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and the British Virgin Islands. Cameron was actively bleeding the investor capital out of the country and hiding it in jurisdictions that refused to cooperate with American financial regulators. But he was not just hoarding the money offshore. He was also spending it at a catastrophic rate locally. I pulled his personal credit reports and cross-referenced them with the corporate expense accounts. The level of debt he was racking up was staggering. He was using company funds to pay the astronomical rent on his Manhattan penthouse. He was leasing a fleet of luxury cars. He was flying private to Europe and staying in five-star hotels. He was dropping tens of thousands of dollars on imported champagne and tailored suits. He was living like a billionaire, but he was financing his entire life with stolen investor capital and high-interest corporate debt. As I stared at the red numbers populating my screen, a darker, more terrifying picture began to emerge. The legitimate venture capital money was not enough to sustain his reckless spending. The ledgers showed massive influxes of cash coming from untraceable domestic sources. These were short-term loans with extortionate interest rates attached to them. He had burned through the legitimate money and turned to unregulated black market lenders to keep the illusion alive. He owed millions to people who did not resolve their financial disputes in a courtroom. He was trapped in a highly toxic financial sinkhole, and the walls were caving in on him. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my eyes. The sheer scale of his delusion was hard to comprehend, but a massive question remained unanswered. A shell company of this magnitude requires significant seed money to get off the ground. You cannot rent a luxury penthouse and hire expensive public relations firms without initial capital to prove you are worth investing in. Where did the original money come from to start this massive con 3 years ago? I grabbed my coffee mug and took a long sip of the bitter cold liquid. I turned back to the keyboard and initiated a reverse audit on the very first deposits ever made into the Apex Solutions corporate accounts. I bypassed the offshore noise and focused entirely on the domestic origin points from 36 months ago. The software churned through the data, peeling back the layers of financial obfuscation. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, my heart pounding a steady rhythm in my chest. The system finally isolated the origin accounts. I clicked on the final ledger to reveal the names attached to the routing numbers. The screen flashed bright white, and the names materialized in bold black text: Thomas and Diane. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the names, unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The initial seed money did not come from early angel investors or foolish friends. The money came directly from my parents and their primary joint checking account. I pulled the transaction history linking their personal accounts to the shell company. For the past 3 years, my parents had been secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into Cameron and his empty enterprise. They had not just bailed him out of a recent tight spot. They had been the primary financial engine driving this entire criminal illusion from day one. They had knowingly poured their own wealth into his black hole of debt to protect him. They wanted to maintain the perfect family image so badly that they became active participants in a massive financial cover-up. Everything finally made sickening perfect sense. They did not forge my power of attorney because Cameron made a simple business mistake. They forged it because their own money was entirely gone. They had bled themselves dry funding his lies, and now the violent underground creditors were knocking on the door. They needed my $680,000 trust fund to show guaranteed liquid capital to lure in one final massive round of legitimate investors. They were planning to use the new money to pay off the bad debt and save themselves from total ruin. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom, my career, and my future to protect their golden child. I slowly closed the ledger file. The anger inside me vanished completely, replaced by a freezing, absolute calm. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare. I looked at the burner laptop and began compiling the final pages of the most devastating forensic dossier of my entire career. I sat back in the metal folding chair and stared at the glowing monitor in Mitchell and his basement. The raw data pulling from the secure servers painted a picture so grotesque that I had to force myself to keep breathing steadily. I asked Mitchell to hand me the encrypted hard drive containing the property tax records for Fairfield County. I plugged the drive into my burner laptop and cross-referenced the deed history for the sprawling Connecticut estate where I grew up. My parents, Thomas and Diane, have spent 3 decades projecting the flawless image of untouchable generational wealth. They host lavish charity galas on their manicured lawns, drive imported luxury sedans, and maintain lifetime memberships at the most exclusive country clubs on the East Coast. They walk through the world demanding respect based purely on their perceived financial superiority. But the digital ledger on my screen told a completely different story. I ran a full liability scan on my parents and their personal identifying information. The screen immediately flooded with bright red markers indicating severe financial distress. They were not just experiencing a temporary cash flow problem or a minor dip in their investment returns. They were entirely, completely, and irredeemably broke. I pulled up the mortgage history on the Connecticut estate. The house had been fully paid off since I was in high school. A pristine asset sitting on acres of valuable land. But 2 years ago, exactly, when Cameron started burning through his initial seed money, a massive home equity line of credit was suddenly opened against the property. 6 months after that initial withdrawal, they refinanced the entire estate, pulling out millions of dollars in liquid cash. They did not use that money for property renovations or legitimate market investments. The tracing software showed the funds being wired directly into Cameron and his empty Delaware shell company. But even that massive influx of cash was not enough to sustain his reckless Manhattan lifestyle and his fake corporate payroll. As the legitimate banking options dried up, my father took a much darker and far more desperate path. I cracked open a hidden folder containing unregulated short-term promissory notes. Thomas had leveraged the remaining equity in the estate to secure loans from shadow lenders. These were not standard commercial banks with standard collection procedures. These were aggressive underground creditors operating out of anonymous shell companies in New York and New Jersey. These types of lenders charge predatory interest rates, and they do not use polite phone calls when a client defaults. They use intimidation and immediate asset seizure. The ledgers showed missed payments piling up rapidly over the last 90 days. The balloon payments were coming due this week, and my parents had absolutely zero capital left to cover them. The sprawling manicured estate where I confronted them just yesterday was exactly 72 hours away from a brutal, unannounced foreclosure. They were about to lose the only thing that actually mattered to them, their social status. The sheer desperation radiating from the data was palpable. My parents were backed into a corner with dangerous people breathing down their necks. A rational person would declare bankruptcy and admit defeat. But my parents were too arrogant for reality. Instead, they engineered a masterclass in financial deception. I opened the term sheets for the upcoming Series A funding round. This was the highly confidential paperwork the Wall Street billionaires were scheduled to sign at the charity gala on Friday night. The venture capital firm was offering a massive injection of $15 million to fund Apex Solutions. But institutional investors are not stupid. They demand ironclad collateral before releasing that kind of capital. They required the founders to show a significant amount of unencumbered liquid cash to guarantee the bridge loan until the final contracts cleared standard underwriting. Thomas and Diane had no unencumbered assets left to show. Every single property stock portfolio and retirement account they owned was leveraged to the absolute brim. That was exactly why they needed me. Or rather, that was why they needed my grandfather. The $680,000 trust fund sitting quietly in my name was a pristine, untouched financial asset. It carried no debt, It had no liens against it. It was the perfect bait for their trap. By forging my signature on that power of attorney, they temporarily attached my pristine trust to Cameron and his toxic corporate profile. To the wealthy investors reviewing the surface-level financials, Apex Solutions suddenly looked incredibly healthy and secure. My trust fund proved they had the required cash reserves to secure the $15 million injection. They were using my financial stability as a mask to hide their total ruin. But the most damning piece of evidence was sitting quietly in the automated clearinghouse queue. I breached the internal accounting schedule for Apex Solutions, mapping out exactly what was supposed to happen the minute the $15 million hit the corporate accounts on Friday night. A legitimate tech startup would allocate those funds to hiring software engineers, renting server space, and developing their product. Cameron had none of those things scheduled on the ledger. Instead, the system was preloaded with dozens of automated wire transfers designed to trigger the very second the investor cash cleared the bank. The destination routing numbers for these automated wires matched the underground creditors perfectly. Millions of dollars were scheduled to bounce directly from the new Wall Street investors straight into the pockets of the shadow lenders holding the debt on my parents and their estate. Another massive chunk of cash was routed to pay off the predatory interest on Cameron and his Manhattan penthouse. I stared at the screen as the horrific realization washed over me. It was the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. They were planning to rob new investors to pay off their old debts while producing absolutely zero legitimate revenue. They had constructed a massive criminal vacuum designed to suck in $15 million and immediately distribute it to save their own skin. If this transaction went through, my family would walk away free and clear. Cameron would get to keep playing the brilliant tech entrepreneur for a few more months. My parents would get to keep their country club memberships and their sprawling estate. And what would happen to me? The second the federal regulators realized the $15 million vanished into a black market void, they would freeze every single asset attached to Apex Solutions. They would see my $680,000 trust fund listed as the primary collateral guaranteeing the bad loan. The government would seize my grandfather and his legacy without a second thought. Worse, the authorities would look at the forged power of attorney and assume I was a willing participant in the fraud. My parents built this entire Ponzi scheme with a built-in scapegoat: me. They planned to let me take the fall for a federal crime while they lived comfortably on stolen money. They assumed I would be too intimidated by their wealth and social standing to look closely at the paperwork. They thought freezing my personal checking accounts would distract me and force me into submission long enough for the Friday night transfer to clear. They drastically underestimated the cold analytical precision required to be a senior forensic accountant. I do not panic when the numbers stop making sense. I just keep digging until I find the bodies. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the automated transfer protocols one more time to ensure my analysis was absolutely flawless. There were no mistakes in my reading of the data. My parents and my brother were active criminals operating a $15 million fraud syndicate. I closed the property tax files and safely ejected the encrypted hard drive, placing it carefully on the desk. The puzzle was completely solved. I had uncovered the dark secret of their bankruptcy, the desperation of their hidden mortgages, the exact blueprint of how my trust fund was being used as bait, and the ultimate endgame of their Ponzi scheme. They had meticulously planned my financial execution to ensure their own survival. I took a deep breath of the cool basement air. I was holding enough digital evidence to put my entire bloodline in a federal penitentiary for decades. All I had to do now was build the trap that would catch them in the act. I turned away from the property tax ledgers and focused my attention back on the central communication servers for Apex Solutions. Knowing the mechanics of the fraud was only half the battle. I needed to know the exact timeline. A multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme does not operate on a casual schedule. The underground creditors holding my parents' debt were violent, impatient people. They would have demanded a specific date for their repayment. I told Mitchell to help me isolate the email traffic flowing through the mobile device of Cameron and his executive assistant. Cameron was far too arrogant to manage his own calendar, and his assistant was notoriously sloppy with her digital security. She constantly connected to unsecured public wireless networks at the expensive coffee shops she frequented in Manhattan. It took Mitchell less than 12 minutes to spoof her device credentials and mirror her entire inbox directly onto my secondary monitor. I began filtering this massive influx of unread messages, ignoring the catering invoices and the public relations updates. I ran a targeted search algorithm looking for keywords related to the venture capital firm, the bridge loan, and the final contract execution. The system pinged a direct hit on a highly encrypted email thread buried in a VIP correspondence folder. I cracked the basic encryption key and opened the message. It was a finalized logistical itinerary sent directly from the lead underwriter of the Wall Street Investment Group. As I read the details of the itinerary, the blood drained from my face. My parents and Cameron were hosting a massive philanthropic charity gala this coming Friday night at an ultra-exclusive ballroom in Midtown Manhattan. The charity aspect was nothing but a glittering distraction designed to stroke the egos of the financial elite. The true purpose of the event was explicitly outlined in the schedule for the private VIP reception. At 9 o'clock on Friday night, Cameron was scheduled to give a closed-door presentation to the lead hedge fund managers. According to the internal memos attached to the thread, these investors were bringing their legal teams to the gala to sign the final authorization papers. They were prepared to execute a direct wire transfer of $15 million straight into the Apex Solutions corporate accounts before the gala concluded. I stared at the glowing digital clock in the corner of my screen. It was Tuesday afternoon. I had less than 72 hours before that $15 million moved across the federal wire system. My mind raced through the catastrophic legal implications of that deadline. In financial crimes, the physical movement of the money is the absolute point of no return. Right now, the fraud was technically contained. It was a massive conspiracy, but the devastating final act had not yet occurred. However, the very second those wealthy investors signed the authorization and the $15 million hit the automated clearinghouse, the crime would be permanently cemented in the federal banking infrastructure. The money would instantly fracture into the automated offshore accounts, paying off the shadow lenders and securing my parents' estate. But the federal government monitors transactions of that magnitude. When the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation inevitably realized the money vanished into a black market void, they would immediately freeze every single asset attached to Apex Solutions. They would look at the corporate paperwork and see my $680,000 trust fund listed as the primary collateral guaranteeing the fraudulent bridge loan. The federal prosecutors would not care that my signature was forged. They would look at the court-ordered medical conservatorship my father had filed claiming I was mentally unstable. They would assume I was a willing participant in the fraud who had suffered a breakdown when the pressure got too high. The government would seize my grandfather and his legacy without a single second thought, using my trust to compensate the defrauded investors. I would lose my entire life savings, my professional licenses, and my freedom. I would be indicted as a co-conspirator while my parents and my brother lived comfortably on the money they skimmed off the top. The sheer weight of the ticking clock pressed down on my chest. A normal person would have collapsed under the paralyzing anxiety. But I do not process fear like a normal person. I channel it into cold, relentless calculation. I had less than 3 days to completely dismantle a $15 million scam and sever my identity from their criminal enterprise. I looked at Mitchell and told him we needed to go dark and work through the night. I was not going to rely on a quick phone call to a regulatory agency to stop this. Bureaucracies move too slowly. If I submitted a standard fraud tip to the authorities, it would sit on a desk for weeks while an entry-level analyst verified the claims. By the time they opened an official investigation, my trust fund would be long gone. I needed to build a weapon so precise and so devastatingly comprehensive that it would force immediate, decisive action. I started compiling a bulletproof forensic dossier. I opened a fresh master document and began systematically dragging and dropping the digital evidence I had harvested over the last 10 hours. This was not just a collection of bank statements. It was a flawlessly structured prosecution file designed to spoon-feed the entire criminal conspiracy to federal agents. I started with the foundation of the lie. I created a section dedicated exclusively to the forged power of attorney. I imported the high-resolution image of the fake signature side by side with my actual verified signature. More importantly, I attached the raw electronic metadata proving the document was executed from the Internet Protocol address registered to Cameron and his luxury penthouse. I included the timestamp data proving it was signed while I was physically miles away at my corporate office. Next, I built the financial architecture of the shell company. I pulled the State Labor Department filings proving that Apex Solutions had absolutely zero software engineers on its payroll. I attached the municipal zoning records proving their corporate headquarters was nothing more than a virtual mailbox located inside a failing strip mall. I created extensive visual flowcharts mapping the flow of seed money from my parents and their personal checking accounts directly into Cameron and his empty enterprise. I documented every single dollar they had burned to maintain the illusion of a booming tech startup. Then I moved to the darkest part of the dossier: the motive. I downloaded the property tax records and the hidden secondary mortgage documents attached to my parents and their Connecticut estate. I included the aggressive collection notices from the underground creditors demanding immediate payment. I highlighted the balloon payments coming due, mapping them directly against the automated wire transfers Cameron had preloaded into the Apex Solutions banking portal. I created a stark, undeniable timeline showing exactly how the $15 million from the new investors was going to be immediately siphoned off to save my parents from a brutal foreclosure. I worked relentlessly, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitors. I drank cup after cup of bitter black coffee to keep my mind razor sharp. I did not stop to eat. I did not stop to rest. Every time I felt a wave of exhaustion threatening to slow my fingers, I thought about my father standing in his mahogany study, telling me I was hysterical. I thought about my mother rolling her eyes and calling me selfish. I thought about my brother sipping a mimosa while holding a match to my entire future. The anger was a perfect, clean fuel. By Wednesday morning, the basement war room was littered with empty coffee cups and discarded legal pads. The sunlight creeping through the small ground-level windows signaled the start of a new day. I hit the final keystroke and sat back in my chair. The master document was complete. It was exactly 100 pages long. It contained 42 exhibits, 27 financial flowcharts, and 14 sworn affidavits, cross-referenced from public tax registries. I connected a heavy-duty laser printer to the secure network and hit print. The machine hummed to life, churning out page after page of undeniable truth. I stood over the printer watching the warm pages stack up in the output tray. Each sheet of paper represented a nail in the coffin of my family and their carefully constructed empire of lies. I gathered the pages, aligning the edges perfectly, and secured them inside a thick black binder. I ran my hand over the smooth plastic cover. This was not just a report. It was the physical manifestation of my entire professional career, weaponized against the people who thought I was nothing but a boring corporate drone. I had successfully documented every falsified record, every offshore wire transfer, and every forged signature. I had mathematically proven their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. But holding the evidence in my hands was only the first step of the strategy. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. I had roughly 48 hours left before the Friday night gala. 100-page binder sitting in a suburban basement could not stop a $15 million wire transfer. I needed to deliver this evidence to the right people, and I needed to do it in a way that guaranteed maximum immediate destruction. I needed to make sure that when the clock struck 9 on Friday night, the trap would snap shut so violently that my family would never recover. The neon sign of Pete's Diner buzzed with a rhythmic hum, casting long red shadows across the wet pavement. I sat in a corner booth nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The bell above the door chimed and David walked in. He wore a trench coat pulled tight against the chill, his eyes darting around the empty diner before locking onto my booth. He slid into the vinyl seat across from me, wiping rain from his forehead. He looked exactly like a bank manager who realized he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I pulled a thick manila folder from my bag and slid it across the sticky Formica table. "What is this, Justine?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is your salvation," I said flatly. "Or your indictment. The choice depends entirely on how you handle the next 10 minutes. He opened the folder hesitantly. Inside were high-resolution prints of the power of attorney document he had authorized just days prior. Next to it was the forensic metadata report I had pulled directly from the digital signature file. I watched his eyes scan the highlighted sections. The IP address originating from my family's estate. The notary stamp belonging to my brother's college fraternity brother. The timestamp proving the document was fabricated while I was actively logging into my own secure workstation 3 states away. David swallowed hard, pushing the folder back an inch as if it were radioactive. "They told me you were hospitalized. Your mother was crying in my office, Justine. She had medical letterheads." "Forged letterheads," I corrected sharply, "which you failed to verify with the issuing hospital. You processed a fraudulent POA on a $15 million trust fund without a secondary verbal confirmation. If this goes to the banking commission, you lose your license. If it goes to a federal judge, you lose your freedom." David rubbed his temples. "Why are you showing this to me instead of just calling the fraud department?" "Because if I call the fraud department right now, they freeze the account, investigate for 6 months, and my family gets away with claiming it was a clerical error." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "I do not want them to get away with a slap on the wrist. I want them caught in the act, and for that I need an inside man." I laid out the exact parameters of my plan. Cameron was planning to move the entire $15 million this coming Friday, right before the holiday weekend, to mask the transfer delay. I knew his patterns. He would try to route it through a series of offshore holding accounts to sanitize the money before dropping it into his failing company's ledger. "I need you to implement a hard stop protocol on his specific routing numbers," I instructed. David shook his head frantically. "Justine, I cannot do that. Altering the back-end routing without a direct court order is grounds for immediate termination. It is career suicide." "Approving a forged document is actual suicide," I countered, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Here's how it works. When Cameron initiates the wire transfer on Friday, the front-end system needs to show him a confirmation screen. Let him think the money is successfully moving. But on the back end, I want you to reroute the transaction into a zero-balance holding ledger and trigger a manual review code. The money never leaves the bank, but the digital footprint of his attempt is permanently recorded on federal servers." David stared at his cold coffee. He was a career banker, a man who survived by following the rules, but he was also smart enough to know when he had been played. My mother and Cameron had used his trust against him. "If I do this," David said, his voice tight with anxiety, "you promise this dossier never sees the light of day regarding my negligence." "You are a victim of a sophisticated fraud ring, David. You are cooperating with an ongoing investigation. That is the story I will tell." He gave a sharp nod. "Friday morning, the holding ledger will be active. But Justine, once he hits submit, an automatic suspicious activity report gets generated. The feds will be alerted." "I know." I smiled for the first time that night. "I am counting on it." I left David in the diner and walked straight to my car. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and reflective. I drove downtown to the federal building. It was past visiting hours, but I was not there for a public tour. Mitchell had arranged a private meeting with Special Agent Reynolds, a contact in the FBI's white-collar crime division. Mitchell and Reynolds had a history of taking down corporate embezzlers, and my case was exactly the kind of slam-dunk operation Reynolds lived for. The federal building was a fortress of concrete and glass. I badged in through the side security entrance where a junior agent escorted me to a sparse conference room on the 5th floor. Reynolds was waiting. She was a sharp-featured woman in a tailored navy suit who looked like she did not have time for games. "Mitchell tells me you have a $15 million wire fraud about to go down," Reynolds said, skipping introductions entirely. "He also says the perpetrators are your own family. Blood does not make them innocent," I replied, taking the seat across from her. I placed the second more comprehensive copy of my dossier on the table. "In fact, it makes them careless." Reynolds opened the file. I walked her through the entire operation step by step. I showed her the initial trust documents, the forged POA, the fake medical records my mother had mocked up, and the offshore routing numbers Cameron intended to use. I explained the timeline. Friday at exactly 10 in the morning, Cameron would initiate the transfer from his private office, believing he had successfully locked me out of the system. "This is remarkably thorough," Reynolds noted, flipping through the IP tracking data. "You did the forensic legwork of an entire cyber division." "I investigate fraud for a living, Agent Reynolds. They just forgot what I do." "You said the bank manager is cooperating." "He is implementing a holding ledger. The money will not actually move, but the wire fraud attempt will be completely executed on their end. The moment Cameron clicks transfer, he commits a federal crime." Reynolds leaned back, tapping her pen against the table. "Wire fraud across state lines, identity theft, and attempted embezzlement of $15 million. If we execute this correctly, we can have agents at his location the moment the ping hits our servers." "Where will he be on Friday?" "He is hosting a massive charity gala," I said. "A smokescreen to celebrate the successful refinancing of his company. My parents will be there popping champagne and accepting praise." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You want us to walk into a high society gala and put them in handcuffs?" "I want you to do your job," I corrected smoothly. "I am just providing the venue." Reynolds closed the folder. "We will have a cyber team monitoring the bank's servers starting Thursday night. The second that transfer is initiated, we move. But you need to be careful, Justine. Cornered animals bite." "I am not cornered," I said, standing up. "They are." By Thursday evening, the trap was fully set. The digital tripwires were active. The federal agents were on standby. The only thing left was for me to prepare for the final confrontation. I needed to walk into that gala not as the broken sister they thought they had discarded, but as the architect of their destruction. I met Mitchell at his brownstone in the historic district. His wife Elise was waiting for me in her expansive dressing room. Elise was a powerhouse in the fashion industry, and when Mitchell told her what I was about to do, she immediately volunteered to serve as my personal armor standard-bearer. "You cannot walk into an execution wearing a business suit, Justine," Elise declared, handing me a garment bag. "You need to look like you own the room, because by tomorrow night you will." I unzipped the bag and gasped. Inside was a floor-length emerald green designer gown. It was crafted from heavy silk that caught the light like liquid glass. It was structured, sharp, and unapologetically bold. "Try it on," she urged. I stepped behind the folding screen and slipped into the dress. It fit perfectly, hugging my frame like a second skin. The high neckline demanded perfect posture, while the dramatic slit in the skirt allowed for a powerful stride. It was not just a dress, it was a statement. I walked out from behind the screen. Elise smiled, and Mitchell, who had just walked into the room, gave a low whistle. "They're going to hand over the keys to the city when you walk in." Mitchell laughed. I turned to look at myself in the full-length mirror. For years, my family had conditioned me to shrink. They wanted me small, quiet, and easily manipulated so Cameron could shine. They wanted me to be the naive girl who would simply cry and accept defeat when they stole $15 million from her. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was none of those things. Her eyes were hard and unyielding. Her posture was straight. She was a woman who hunted predators for a living, and she was about to take down the biggest targets of her career. "How do you feel?" Elise asked, standing behind me and adjusting the drape of the silk. "I feel ready," I said. Everything was perfectly aligned. David was sitting at his terminal waiting to trap the funds. Agent Reynolds had her strike team briefed and waiting for the signal. The gown was ready. The evidence was secured. My mother and Cameron thought they had executed the perfect crime. They thought they had finally outsmarted me and secured their lavish future. They had no idea that tomorrow night, the moment they raised their glasses to toast their success, the entire foundation of their stolen empire would collapse. I took one last look in the mirror, locking eyes with my own reflection. I was walking straight into the lion's den, but I was not the prey. I was the trap. Tomorrow, the hunt ends. Friday night in Manhattan carried a distinct electric charge, especially outside the Waldorf Astoria. Black town cars lined the curb, discharging the city's financial elite onto the rain-slicked pavement. I stepped out of Mitchell's chartered sedan, the heavy silk of the emerald green gown sweeping against the red carpet. The cool night air hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculated focus. The hunt had officially moved from the digital realm into the physical world. At the entrance, a line of imposing security guards checked names against a digital tablet. I did not flinch as I approached the velvet rope. Mitchell had secured my entry under a corporate pseudonym, listing me as a senior acquisitions director for a shadowy European holding firm. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man with an earpiece, scanned my forged RSVP credential. He glanced at me, taking in the designer gown and my unyielding posture before swiping his finger across the screen and stepping aside to grant me access. I walked into the grand ballroom, and the sheer audacity of my family's deception hit me like a physical wave. The room was a monument to unearned arrogance. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of guests. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. A string quartet played softly from a raised dais, their music barely audible over the low, confident hum of billionaire investors and hedge fund managers negotiating their next big acquisitions. In the center of it all stood Cameron. He was completely in his element, radiating the polished, manufactured charm of a successful tech visionary. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that probably cost more than the average car, a cocktail glass balanced effortlessly in one hand, while he gestured broadly with the other. He was surrounded by a circle of older, wealthy men, spinning them a fabricated tale about his company's explosive growth metrics and revolutionary software algorithms. I watched his mouth move, recognizing the exact cadence of his lies. He was selling them empty air funded by the $15 million he believed he had successfully stolen from me just 12 hours prior. Not far from Cameron, Thomas and Diane held court near the main bar. My parents played the roles of the proud, affluent benefactors to absolute perfection. Diane wore a diamond necklace that caught the chandelier light, laughing musically at a joke made by a prominent venture capitalist. Thomas stood with his chest puffed out, accepting handshakes and congratulations on his son's monumental corporate relaunch. They looked utterly relaxed. They looked victorious. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a burden, an afterthought, a disappointing obstacle in the path of their golden boy. Now they believed they had finally neutralized me legally and financially, paving the way for Cameron's ultimate triumph. Disgust curled in the pit of my stomach, thick and acidic. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and retreated to the periphery of the room, melting into the shadows cast by a towering floral arrangement. From this vantage point, I possessed a perfect tactical view of the entire ballroom. I was a ghost in the machine, the unseen variable in their flawless equation. I watched the carefully orchestrated choreography of the gala unfold. Cameron's strategy was obvious and predatory. He would butter up an investor with industry buzzwords and false financial projections, then subtly direct them toward a roped-off VIP section near the main stage. There, a heavy oak table had been set up, draped in dark velvet, and flanked by 2 private security guards. This was the signing table. I observed as a prominent venture capitalist sat down, accepted a gold-plated pen from Cameron, and signed a stack of investment contracts. They were securing fresh capital based on fraudulent collateral. Cameron was using the illusion of the $15 million trust fund injection to validate his company's worth to outside investors. He was leveraging stolen money to steal even more money. It was a Ponzi scheme wrapped in a tuxedo, and my family was cheering it on. I checked my watch. 8:45. Agent Reynolds and her cyber team were monitoring the situation from a mobile command unit parked 3 blocks away. David, the bank manager, had confirmed via an encrypted text that Cameron had initiated the wire transfer exactly at 10 o'clock that morning. The money had been successfully caught in the zero balance holding ledger. The automatic suspicious activity report had been generated and sent to the federal databases. The federal crime had been committed. Now all that remained was the public execution of the trap. I needed to be in position. The floor of the ballroom was too crowded, too chaotic for what I had planned. I required absolute control over the environment. I needed the high ground. I set my glass down on a passing tray and began to move. I navigated the perimeter of the ballroom, keeping my face angled away from the center of the crowd where my mother was holding court. The emerald gown allowed me to blend seamlessly with the high society guests, but my purposeful stride was entirely different from the meandering pace of the partygoers. I spotted the target, a set of heavy double doors near the kitchen entrance marked staff only. 2 event security guards stood a few feet away, currently distracted by a guest complaining about a missing coat check ticket. I did not break my stride. I waited for the exact second the heavier guard turned his head to speak into his shoulder radio, then slipped through the double doors, letting them click shut silently behind me. The atmosphere changed instantly. The warm, golden light and classical music were replaced by harsh fluorescent bulbs and the chaotic clatter of the catering staff. Waiters rushed past me carrying trays of empty glasses, too busy to question a woman in a designer gown walking through their workspace. I kept my head down and moved briskly toward the back of the corridor, searching for the service stairwell. I found the heavy metal door tucked behind a stack of unused banquet chairs. I pushed it open and began the climb. The concrete stairs echoed slightly under my heels, a sharp, rhythmic tapping that matched the accelerating beat of my heart. I climbed 3 flights, my muscles burning under the heavy silk of the dress, until I reached the mezzanine level. The hallway here was dark and completely deserted, smelling faintly of ozone and old dust. This was the technical spine of the ballroom, housing the lighting rigs, the catwalks, and my ultimate destination, the audiovisual control room. I approached the door to the AV room carefully. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of blue light spilling out into the dark hallway. I peered inside. A single technician sat at a massive soundboard wearing heavy headphones and scrolling through a playlist on a glowing monitor. He was completely isolated from the party below, entirely focused on his screen. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The technician did not look up. I walked up right behind his chair and tapped him firmly on the shoulder. He jumped, pulling his headphones down around his neck, his eyes widening as he took in my appearance. "Excuse me?" he stammered, looking bewildered by the presence of a guest in the technical booth. "You cannot be up here, this is a restricted area." "I am aware," I said smoothly, projecting absolute authority. "I am the event coordinator from the holding firm sponsoring Mr. Cameron's relaunch. There has been a slight change to the evening's scheduled programming." The technician frowned, his hands hovering over the soundboard. "Nobody told me about any changes. The schedule says background strings until the CEO speech at 9:30. The CEO speech has been moved up, and it requires a specific multimedia introduction." I lied with practiced ease, retrieving a silver USB drive from my clutch. "I need you to patch this drive directly into the main projection system and override the current audio feed on my mark." He hesitated, looking from the USB drive to my face. I really should call the floor manager to confirm this. I could lose my job if I mess up the main presentation. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on his desk, bringing my face level with his. "If you do not patch this drive in right now, you will not just lose your job. You will be responsible for ruining a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. Do you want to be the reason this entire gala fails?" The technician swallowed hard, intimidated by the sheer force of my conviction. He took the silver USB drive from my fingers and slotted it into the primary terminal. A folder popped up on his screen labeled Presentation_Final. "Okay," he said nervously. "It is loaded. The main projector screen is rigged to drop down behind the stage. When do you want me to hit play?" "Not yet," I said, stepping past him to look out the large soundproof glass window that overlooked the entire ballroom. From up here, the party looked like a glittering diorama. I could see everything. I saw Cameron laughing, slapping an investor on the back. I saw Diane and Thomas clinking champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the sword hanging directly over their heads. I saw the private signing table where another victim was putting their name on a fraudulent contract. I pulled my phone from my clutch and opened a secure messaging app. I typed a single prearranged code word to Agent Reynolds execute. I watched the ballroom floor below. It took exactly 45 seconds. At the main entrance, the velvet ropes were suddenly unhooked. The polite, imposing event security guards were abruptly shoved aside. A team of 12 men and women in dark windbreakers with stark yellow lettering across their backs flooded into the grand ballroom. The FBI had arrived. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly, creating a jarring, terrible silence that swept across the room like a shockwave. Guests turned their heads, their conversations dying in their throats, as the federal agents formed a tactical perimeter around the main stage and the private signing table. I looked down at Cameron. The smooth, confident smile had frozen on his face, rapidly melting into an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked frantically toward the entrance, then toward his parents. Diane dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor, a sharp, crystalline crash that echoed up to my glass window. Thomas stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the bar for support, his face draining of all color as two federal agents marched straight toward his golden boy. I turned back to the terrified technician sitting at the soundboard. The trap had been sprung. The predators were cornered. It was time to drop the curtain. "Drop the main screen," I commanded, my voice cold and echoing in the small room. "And hit play." The technician hesitated for a fraction of a second. I did not give him the chance to reconsider. I stepped smoothly around his chair, gently, but immovably, guiding his rolling seat away from the primary console. "Step aside," I instructed, my tone brooking absolute zero resistance. "I have authorization from the highest level of this federal investigation. Touch that board again and you become an accessory to wire fraud." He raised his hands in surrender, wheeling backward into the shadows of the booth. I took his place at the console. The illuminated buttons and sliders reflected in my eyes as I pulled a second heavily encrypted flash drive from my clutch. The first drive had been a decoy to gain his compliance. This one was the actual weapon. I slotted it directly into the main projection server port. A command terminal popped up on the monitor. I typed my decryption key with rapid, precise keystrokes. The system accepted the override protocol. I now had total control of the visual and audio feeds for the entire ballroom. I glanced down through the soundproof glass window. The tactical chessboard was perfectly arranged. Down below, the ambient lighting of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom began to dim automatically, following the pre-programmed schedule I had just hijacked. The string quartet faded into a respectful silence as their stage monitors signaled the end of their set. A warm theatrical spotlight illuminated the main stage. Cameron, completely blind to the federal agents silently securing the perimeter doors in the shadows, adjusted his bespoke tuxedo jacket and confidently strode up to the lucite podium. He tapped the microphone. The sharp, amplified thumps echoed through the cavernous room, drawing the attention of every billionaire, venture capitalist, and socialite present. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Cameron began, his voice dripping with that manufactured golden boy charisma he had weaponized our entire lives. "Tonight is not just a celebration of corporate synergy. It is a celebration of vision. It is a celebration of family." I scoffed silently in the booth. The sheer audacity was staggering. Thomas and Diane stood in the front row, beaming with unearned pride. Diane wiped a fake tear from her cheek. They were playing their parts perfectly, entirely convinced that they had outmaneuvered me, stolen my legacy, and paved a golden road for their favorite child. Cameron leaned into the microphone, flashing his signature winning smile. "In the tech industry, we talk a lot about disruption. We talk about breaking the mold. But none of that is possible without rock-solid liquid foundations. Investors need security. You need to know that the visionary you are backing has the capital to execute." He paced the stage, owning the room. "I am thrilled to announce that as of this morning, our firm has secured a massive internal capital injection. $15 million of guaranteed liquid collateral. This is not speculative funding. This is hard cleared capital sitting in our holding accounts ready to deploy. He pointed toward the VIP signing tables, where the wealthy investors sat with their gold-plated pens. I invite you all to finalize your authorizations tonight. Partner with us and let us build the future. Cameron turned dramatically toward the massive projection screen hanging behind the stage. He held up a wireless remote clicker. "Let me show you the future," he proclaimed confidently. He pressed the button. That was my cue. I bypassed his remote signal entirely. My fingers hovered over the master control keyboard in the AV booth. I looked down at my brother. For decades, he had stolen my parents' affection, drained their resources, and reveled in my deliberate exclusion. He had tried to steal $15 million to cover up his own catastrophic failures, believing I would just roll over and accept my role as the family scapegoat. Not tonight. I slammed the enter key. The system override engaged instantaneously. The massive screen behind Cameron did not display his sleek, minimalist corporate logo. It did not show his fabricated financial projections or his fake growth metrics. Instead, the screen went entirely black for one agonizing second. Then it flashed a blinding, glaring red. The collective gasp from the ballroom floor was audible even through the soundproof glass of the control booth. Cameron froze, his arms still extended toward the screen. He turned around slowly. Displayed in towering high-definition resolution was the forged power of attorney document. It was blown up to 30 feet wide, impossible to miss. But it was not just the document. I had designed a brutal, undeniable visual presentation. On the left side of the screen sat the fraudulent document, my forged signature glowing under a bright yellow digital highlighter. On the right side of the screen, a forensic metadata log scrolled in real time. The text displayed the exact IP address used to submit the document. Below the IP address, a clean, bold text box translated the technical data for the non-technical crowd origin location, private residence of Thomas and Diane. A second slide automatically triggered. It showed the notary stamp accompanied by a side-by-side photograph of the notary drinking beers with Cameron at a college fraternity party, proving the fraudulent collusion. The murmurs in the crowd morphed into a rising tide of alarmed voices. The billionaire investors at the VIP table dropped their gold-plated pens. They were sharks, and they smelled blood in the water, but it was not mine. It was Cameron's. Cameron frantically clicked his remote, his thumb mashing the button in a desperate, pathetic attempt to shut off the screen. "Cut it!" he screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with panic. "Cut the feed! It is a hack! We are being hacked!" His charming facade dissolved instantly, replaced by the terrified, incompetent fraud he truly was. I engaged the audio override. I cut his microphone feed dead. His frantic shouting was reduced to a pathetic, unaudible mime on the grand stage. I patched my own headset microphone directly into the ballroom's main speaker system. My voice, calm, cold, and resonating with absolute authority, boomed across the Waldorf Astoria. "This is not a hack, Cameron," I stated. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "This is an audit." The lead venture capitalist, a silver-haired man who had been seconds away from signing a multi-million-dollar term sheet, abruptly stood up. He shoved his chair back so violently it tipped over, crashing onto the marble floor. He pointed an accusing finger directly at Cameron. "You told me your collateral was verified," he bellowed, his face turning purple with rage. "You tried to leverage stolen trust funds to secure my capital." Cameron held his hands up in a placating gesture, sweating profusely under the stage lights. "It is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice raw without the microphone's amplification. "My sister is unwell. She is having a mental break." The lie was so pathetic, so utterly transparent against the glaring 30-foot high-definition evidence behind him that several investors actually scoffed in disgust. They began signaling their associates to gather their briefcases and exit the vicinity immediately. They recognized a sinking ship, and Cameron's hull had just been ripped wide open. Diane lunged forward, grabbing Thomas by the lapels of his tuxedo. "Do something," she hissed frantically, her perfectly manicured facade completely shattered. "Thomas!" They are all looking at us. Call security. Get her out of that booth. Thomas just stared at the massive projection screen, his mouth hanging open. For the first time in his arrogant, entitled life, he was entirely powerless. He could not bully his way out of a digital paper trail. He could not gaslight a room full of furious financial titans. He looked utterly diminished, a small, petty man who had finally been caught in a lifetime of lies. He looked up toward the AV booth, his eyes squinting against the glare of the projection screen. He could not see me through the tinted glass, but he knew. He knew exactly who had orchestrated this execution. Justine Thomas yelled, his voice barely carrying over the commotion. "Stop this right now!" I did not stop. I triggered the next slide. This one was even more devastating. It displayed the 10-year-old credit card statements, the ones Thomas and Diane had opened using my social security number to fund Cameron's lavish lifestyle. I highlighted the fraudulent signatures next to my actual signature. For 10 years, my voice echoed through the ballroom, cutting through the rising panic. My parents allowed me to be the scapegoat of this family. They funded a facade of success for their golden boy using stolen credit. And when his fake empire began to collapse under the weight of his own incompetence, they decided to escalate. They forged medical records. They forged a power of attorney. They attempted to steal a $15 million trust fund left explicitly to me. The venture capitalists at the front were already backing away from the signing tables. A few were furiously dialing their legal teams on their cell phones. No one wanted to be in the blast radius of a federal financial crime. Cameron stood on the stage, visibly shaking. The tailored tuxedo now looked like a costume he had stolen. He looked like a frightened little boy waiting for his parents to bail him out. But Thomas and Diane could not bail him out this time. They were trapped in the exact same net. The technician behind me was plastered against the back wall of the booth, his eyes wide with shock. He had just witnessed the digital annihilation of a tech CEO. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on the floor below. I triggered the final slide. It was a massive, undeniable summary graphic. It listed the federal statutes violated 18 U.S. Code, Section 1343, for wire fraud. 18 U.S. Code Section 1028 for identity theft. The words hung over Cameron's head like a neon guillotine. "You told me family helps family." My voice rang out steady and merciless. "You told me I was being greedy. But you forgot what I do for a living. I hunt financial predators. I trace stolen assets. I build prosecution files that put arrogant thieves into federal prison. And you handed me all the evidence on a silver platter." I released the transmission button on the master control console. The digital command locked into place. Leaving the terrified technician frozen against the back wall, I turned and pushed through the heavy soundproof door. The quiet isolation of the mezzanine hallway enveloped me for only a fraction of a second before I stepped out into the open air of the grand balcony. Below me, the Waldorf Astoria ballroom was a tableau of absolute paralysis. The silence was not peaceful. It was the suffocating, highly pressurized vacuum that precedes a massive explosion. I walked toward the sweeping marble staircase that connected the balcony to the main floor. I held a live wireless microphone loosely in my right hand. The emerald silk of Elise's designer gown cascaded around my legs, whispering against the polished stone with every step. I did not rush. I descended the stairs with the slow, deliberate pacing of an executioner who knows the condemned has absolutely nowhere left to run. Every single face in the cavernous room turned upward to watch my descent. The billionaires, the venture capitalists, the socialites who had been sipping champagne just moments ago now stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I could see the exact moment the collective realization washed over them. I was not a glitch. I was not a nameless hacker. I was the architect of the digital slaughter displayed on the 30-foot screen behind the stage. Thomas broke the silence. His voice, usually so measured and full of false paternal authority, cracked with sheer panic. "Security!" Thomas bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling finger at me as I reached the halfway point of the staircase. "Get your hands on her right now. She is unwell. My daughter is suffering from a severe psychological break. She is under a strict medical conservatorship. This is a manic episode. Remove her from the premises immediately. Two of the event security guards, confused and caught completely off guard by the sheer magnitude of the disruption, took a hesitant step toward the base of the stairs. They reached for their radios, their eyes darting between Thomas's frantic gesturing and my unyielding composure. I did not break my stride. I raised the microphone to my lips. "If any private security contractor touches me," I stated, my voice echoing with chilling clarity through the ballroom's premium sound system, "you will be named as a co-conspirator in an active federal wire fraud investigation. I suggest you step back and keep your hands entirely to yourselves." The guards froze instantly. You do not get to work high-end corporate galas in Manhattan without knowing how to smell a genuine legal threat. They backed away slowly, raising their hands in a gesture of total surrender, leaving Thomas utterly exposed. I reached the bottom of the marble staircase. The crowd naturally parted for me, creating a wide, unobstructed path straight toward the stage. The wealthy elite shrank back, protecting their bespoke suits and designer gowns from the blast radius of my family's imminent destruction. I ignored Thomas completely. I did not look at his sweating, panicked face. I did not look at Diane, who was hyperventilating, clutching her diamond necklace as if it could somehow protect her from the truth. I walked directly toward the front row of VIP investors. These were the men and women holding the gold-plated pens the Marks Cameron had lined up for the slaughter. "My father would like you to believe I am experiencing a medical emergency," I said smoothly, pacing slowly in front of the velvet-roped signing tables. "He wants you to believe that the 30-foot projection of his IP address, his fraudulent notary stamp, and his forged legal documents are the hallucinations of a broken woman. But numbers do not hallucinate, ladies and gentlemen, and metadata does not lie." I clicked the remote in my left hand. The massive screen behind the stage shifted. The forged power of attorney vanished, replaced instantly by a complex but highly readable financial flowchart. I had designed this presentation for maximum devastation. "Let us examine the supposedly guaranteed liquid collateral Mr. Cameron promised you tonight." I continued adopting the clinical, razor-sharp tone I used when testifying as an expert witness in federal court. "He stood on this stage and asked you to trust his vision. He asked you to sign multi-million-dollar term sheets based on a massive internal capital injection. He lied to you." I pointed to the top of the flowchart. "The funds he referenced do not belong to his firm. They are the contents of my personal trust, valued at exactly $680,000. Money left exclusively to me by my grandfather precisely because my father and brother have a well-documented history of burning through capital like dry kindling." Cameron gripped the edges of the lucite podium. He looked like he was going to vomit. His knuckles were white, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. "But a stolen trust fund is just the beginning of the deception," I announced, clicking to the next slide. The screen flashed a stark, undeniable spreadsheet. The title across the top read, "Apex Solutions, True Ledger." "You were handed glossy brochures tonight showing a tech startup on the verge of exponential market dominance," I told the silent room. "You were shown profit margins that defied industry standards. Here is the actual unedited balance sheet for Apex Solutions. This is the ledger Cameron desperately tried to hide behind shell companies and NDA agreements." I highlighted specific rows on the screen using the laser pointer on my remote. The venture capitalist who had previously knocked over his chair let out a low, furious curse. The sheer brazenness of Cameron's lie was unraveling right in front of their eyes. "Apex Solutions is not a unicorn," I stated ruthlessly. "It is a highly flammable house of cards. But wait, the financial rot goes much deeper than corporate mismanagement. It is a family tradition." I clicked the remote again. The screen changed to display a series of scanned official legal documents. The red ink of the county clerk's stamp was visible on every page. "You have all been sipping champagne provided by Thomas and Diane," I said, finally turning my gaze to my parents. "They have spent the evening shaking your hands, posing as affluent benefactors, and projecting an image of generational wealth. Allow me to present the current legal status of their primary estate." The text on the screen was magnified. It was a formal notice of default. They secretly remortgaged their entire property to bail out their golden boy's failing company. I explained, my voice ringing with righteous, unstoppable momentum. They are currently 60 days delinquent on their mortgage payments. The bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings last week. The designer clothes they are wearing tonight, the champagne you are drinking, the venue we are standing in. All of it was rented on borrowed time and stolen credit. They are entirely bankrupt morally and financially. Diane let out a choked, devastated sob. She buried her face in her hands, unable to look at the society friends she had spent decades trying to impress. The illusion she had sacrificed her own daughter to protect was completely, irreparably shattered. I turned my back on her and walked straight up to the edge of the stage, locking eyes with Cameron. He looked down at me from behind the podium, completely stripped of his arrogance. "You thought you could forge my signature," I told him, making sure the microphone picked up every syllable. "You thought you could log into a banking portal, upload a fabricated medical document, and drain my accounts to pay off your loan sharks. You thought I would just cry, accept defeat, and let you walk away with my legacy." I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. "But you didn't just steal from your sister, Cameron. You used a fraudulent asset to solicit investment from regulated financial entities. You leveraged stolen capital to manipulate accredited investors." I swept my arm toward the VIP tables. "You tried to defraud the SEC, and you did it by initiating an electronic wire transfer across state lines." The reaction from the floor was instantaneous and explosive. The wealthy investors did not just drop their gold-plated pens, they began snapping them in half. A tidal wave of absolute fury erupted from the VIP section. These were people who destroyed careers for sport, and they had just realized they were seconds away from funding a blatant Ponzi scheme. A prominent hedge fund manager in the second row picked up his leather-bound contract, ripped it straight down the middle, and threw the pieces violently onto the floor. "You arrogant, fraudulent punk!" he roared at Cameron. Others followed suit. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the ballroom, a beautiful symphony of my brother's total destruction. Binders were slammed shut. Assistants were furiously instructed to cancel all pending authorizations. The room devolved into a chaotic swarm of enraged billionaires demanding accountability. Thomas could not handle the collapse of his world. His mind, conditioned by a lifetime of bullying and entitlement, snapped under the pressure of public accountability. He saw his wealth, his reputation, and his son's future turning to ash, and he blamed the only person he had ever been able to control. "You vicious, ungrateful wretch!" Thomas screamed. He lunged away from the bar, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He charged toward me, his hands reaching out, his fingers curled into fists. He intended to physically grab me, to drag me away from the crowd, to silence me by any means necessary. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground, my eyes locked on his, completely unbothered by his desperate, pathetic charge. He never made it within 5 feet of me. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom did not just open, they burst inward with terrifying, coordinated force. The loud, concussive bang of the doors slamming against the walls stopped Thomas dead in his tracks. It was not the event security coming to remove me, it was a highly trained tactical team. 12 federal agents flooded the room in a precise militaristic formation. They wore dark tactical gear, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. The stark yellow letters spelling out FBI on their backs commanded absolute compliance. The furious shouting of the investors died instantly, replaced by the heavy, authoritative thud of tactical boots marching across the marble floor. Special Agent Reynolds walked at the head of the formation. She bypassed the stunned crowd, bypassed the bewildered security guards, and marched straight toward the stage. 2 agents immediately flanked Thomas, grabbing his arms and twisting them expertly behind his back before he could even process what was happening. "Thomas, Diane, and Cameron." Agent Reynolds announced, her voice projecting across the silent, stunned ballroom without the need for a microphone. "You are being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud." "Get your hands off my husband!" Diane shrieked hysterically, clutching at the agents securing Thomas. Another agent stepped forward, gently but firmly spinning Diane around and applying a pair of cold steel handcuffs to her wrists. The metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet room. Diane let out a horrified wail, completely breaking down as the reality of her new devastating reality set in. On the stage, Cameron did not fight. He did not run. He simply raised his hands in the air, tears streaming down his face as two agents ascended the stairs and placed him in handcuffs right behind his own lucite podium. The Golden Boy, the tech visionary, the pride of the family, was publicly shackled in front of New York's financial elite. I stood in my emerald gown, the microphone lowered to my side, watching the flawless execution of the trap I had built. I watched as my family, the people who had treated me like disposable trash for my entire life, were marched through the center of the ballroom in handcuffs. The elite crowd parted for them, their faces masked in disgust and judgment. They had tried to take everything from me. Instead, they had handed me the keys to their own prison cells. The hunt was over and the checkmate was absolute. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs clicking shut around Diane's wrists echoed sharply across the silent ballroom. The absolute shock on her face was almost theatrical. For 33 years, she had insulated herself with designer fabrics, high society gala tickets, and the stolen credit of her only daughter. Now stripped of her manufactured armor, she looked remarkably small. The federal agents turned her toward the grand exit, their grips firm and unyielding on her arms. As she was forcibly marched past the velvet ropes, her knees buckled. Her expensive heels scraped violently against the polished marble floor. She looked wildly over her shoulder, her eyes frantic and wide, searching the sea of stunned billionaires for a lifeline that did not exist. Finally, her gaze locked onto me. I stood perfectly still on the bottom step of the grand staircase, the wireless microphone hanging loosely at my side, my posture unbroken. Diane dug her heels into the floor, fighting the agent's forward momentum for just one desperate second. Tears ruined her immaculate makeup, carving dark, jagged lines down her cheeks. "Justine, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail that carried to every corner of the room. "Tell them. Tell these agents to stop. Tell them it is just a family misunderstanding. We can fix this at home. Please, you are my daughter." I looked at the woman who had forged medical documents to declare me legally insane. I looked at the woman who had laughed over dinner while handing my life savings to a failed, arrogant tech bro. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was mere inches from her tear-streaked face. "Family first, Mom," I replied, my voice dropping to a cold, merciless whisper that only she and the arresting agents could hear. "I am just protecting the family assets." I turned my back on her before she could draw breath to scream. The heavy mahogany doors of the Waldorf Astoria swung open, revealing the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting on the street. The agents pulled Diane out into the cold night air, followed immediately by Thomas, who walked with his head bowed in absolute defeat, and Cameron, who was openly sobbing. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing their fate and cementing my total victory. 3 months later, the legal and financial fallout hit my family with the destructive force of a localized hurricane. The justice system usually grinds forward at a sluggish pace, but when federal prosecutors are handed an airtight, meticulously documented forensic dossier, the timeline accelerates beautifully. The fraudulent medical conservatorship was the very first domino to fall. I sat in a sterile, wood-paneled courtroom alongside Mitchell, watching the legal unraveling of the people who shared my bloodline. A stern family court judge took less than 20 minutes to throw out the forged medical evaluations. The notary public, Cameron's loyal college fraternity brother, had immediately folded under federal pressure. To avoid maximum prison time, he testified under oath that Thomas had explicitly directed him to backdate the notary stamp on the power of attorney. Cameron's grand illusion of being an untouchable tech visionary shattered completely under the glaring, unforgiving lights of a federal indictment. He was formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and securities fraud. The federal prosecutors, armed with the metadata I had provided and the testimonies of the furious venture capitalists from the gala, offered zero leniency. My brother, the Golden Boy, who could do no wrong, was now facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. His name was permanently cemented as a cautionary tale in the financial sector, his company liquidated to pay off the predatory lenders he had foolishly courted. Thomas and Diane fared no better. The shield of generational wealth they had hidden behind was entirely stripped away. They were formally indicted as co-conspirators in the federal wire fraud case. Without the influx of my stolen trust fund, their financial reality collapsed. The bank, no longer willing to entertain their desperate pleas for extensions, finalized the foreclosure on their sprawling suburban estate. Their luxury vehicles were repossessed in broad daylight. Their prestigious country club memberships were revoked by a board of directors eager to distance themselves from convicted felons. Thomas and Diane were forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city while awaiting their criminal trials. They were entirely isolated, cut off from the affluent friends who now treated their names like a contagious disease. While my family's empire burned to the ground, my own financial restoration was methodical, ruthless, and immensely satisfying. Agent Reynolds and the federal prosecutors moved swiftly to unfreeze my trust fund. The $680,000 was officially released back into my absolute control, secure and completely untouched by Cameron's greedy hands. But Mitchell, brilliant and relentless in the courtroom, did not stop there. Using the undeniable evidence of the 10-year-old credit card fraud I had uncovered, he filed a massive, aggressive civil lawsuit against my parents for systemic financial abuse and long-term identity theft. During the intense discovery phase of the civil suit, Mitchell's team uncovered a series of hidden offshore holding accounts that Thomas had desperately tried to conceal from the bankruptcy courts. The civil judge, appalled by the sheer brazenness of my parents' decades-long deception, showed absolutely zero mercy. The hidden assets were fully seized and liquidated by the court. I was awarded a massive civil settlement, legally draining the very last reserves of hidden wealth my parents had hoarded. The money they had stolen to fund Cameron's lavish college days, the credit they had ruined to maintain their pristine image, was returned to me tenfold in the form of punitive damages. I was no longer just a woman who had survived a family betrayal. I was a multimillionaire, financially independent, and fully weaponized by the very people who had tried to destroy me. The crisp, bracing autumn air blew against the towering glass windows of my new office in downtown Boston. I stood looking out over the city skyline, a steaming cup of black coffee in my hand. The office was located on the 30th floor of a sleek, modernist high-rise in the heart of the financial district. The space was immaculate, featuring clean architectural lines, polished concrete floors, and expansive mahogany desks. I walked over to my desk, my heels clicking confidently against the floor. I ran my fingers over the heavy brushed brass nameplate sitting perfectly centered next to my computer monitors. It bore my name, followed by the title of managing partner. I had not returned to my previous corporate job at the accounting firm. While they had cleared my name and offered me a substantial promotion, following the arrests, I no longer had any desire to work under someone else's corporate umbrella. Instead, I had used my restored trust fund and the massive civil settlement to open my own practice. It was an elite boutique forensic accounting firm, and I was the sole founder. My firm specialized exclusively in prosecuting complex white-collar fraud, tracking stolen corporate assets, and dismantling financial predators who believed their wealth made them untouchable. I had built a team of the sharpest, most aggressive financial investigators in the city. Mitchell was on permanent retainer as our primary external litigation counsel. We were highly selective, fiercely independent, and rapidly becoming the most feared auditing firm on the East Coast. The heavy glass door to my office opened softly. My lead junior analyst, a sharp young woman with a brilliant mind for digital forensics, stepped into the room. She handed me a thick, heavily encrypted dossier. "The initial financials on the new client, Justine," she said, tapping the cover of the file. "It is exactly what we suspected. A powerful corporate patriarch is using a web of shell LLCs to actively embezzle a family trust away from his legitimate heirs. The paper trail is buried deep, but the routing numbers are already showing major inconsistencies." I took the heavy file from her hands, feeling the familiar, thrilling weight of a new investigation. I opened the cover and scanned the first page of the banking ledgers. My eyes immediately locked onto the fabricated liabilities and the hidden offshore transfers. It was a sophisticated scheme designed by arrogant people who believed they were the smartest minds in the room. They believed their bloodline gave them the right to steal without consequence. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, the Boston skyline stretching out endlessly behind me. A calm, unshakable smile spread across my face as I turned the page. The predators in this world never truly learn. They always leave a digital footprint, and they always underestimate the people they intend to victimize. But that was perfectly fine with me. I closed the file and set it squarely in the center of my desk. I was exactly where I was meant to be, and I was always ready for the hunt. The story of dismantling a deceptive family empire teaches a profound and necessary lesson about reclaiming your power, setting unbreakable boundaries, and defining your own worth. Often society pressures us to blindly forgive toxic relatives simply because blood is thicker than water. However, true family loyalty should be nurtured and earned through mutual respect, not extorted through manipulation or deceit. When your own parents and siblings view you merely as a scapegoat or a disposable financial asset walking away, is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Justine's triumph wasn't born from chaotic screaming matches, but from methodically building an undeniable fortress of independence. Her financial literacy, professional expertise, and absolute refusal to shrink herself to make others comfortable became her greatest armor. She proved that you never have to accept the diminished narrative others write for you. Predators, even those cleverly disguised as your closest relatives, rely heavily on your silence, guilt, and compliance to execute their self-serving schemes. Holding them accountable is not vindictive. It is simply letting justice take its natural course. Establishing hard boundaries is how you protect your peace, creating the essential space needed to build your own empire from the ground up. Ultimately, you are the sole architect of your future and your happiness. Your inherent value is not determined by those who blindly fail to recognize it, but by your courage to walk away from toxicity and forge your own extraordinary path forward. Have you ever had to draw a hard, uncompromising line with toxic relatives to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to walk away and build your own success story? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this tale of sweet revenge and reclaimed power resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about turning betrayal into absolute triumph. Remember, your future belongs entirely to you. Never let anyone else forge your narrative.